Hello again and welcome back to another video here on Keep Running with BK. And today's video I'm going to be talking about what I believe is the most critical run of the week for endurance athletes. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. We'll be right back right after this. So for any long distance runner, we're endurance athletes, and so the most important part of our training is to develop and build our endurance. And I can't think of any more other run during the week that is more critical than the long run. And that's what I'd like to talk about with you today. So before we get into the details around the long run, first and foremost, as runners, we want to first establish a base routine. We want to establish how many days during the week that we're going to be able to run. We want to kind of get into that rhythm where we're able to run consistently those number of days of the week, establish a base. And then once we've got that established, now we're ready to begin building our endurance by gradually increasing our mileage. And the best way to do that is through the long run. So for most of the years that I've been running, I have run maybe 3 to 4 days a week. So 3 days during the week, and then on Saturday, typically for me, I would go out and run a longer run, really to continue to maintain my mileage, but to build my endurance. And then during training cycles where I was preparing for a race such as a 10K or a half marathon, and then eventually when I moved up to the marathon, then my mileage would gradually increase, and so would the length of my long run. But regardless of what distance you're training for, or even if you were just training for recreational purposes, it's still a good idea to include a long run in your weekly training, as it is really what builds your endurance. Most of our runs during the week we could easily run. They become the building blocks, if you will, to our training capacity. They become the building blocks for our running, but it's the long run that really builds that endurance. It's the long run that really prepares us for those long distance type races that many of us enjoy running in. And so it's the most critical run of the week, and the one for me personally that I look forward to the most, the one that I have the most fond memories of. Rarely do I remember or think of one of my runs during the week. It's usually the experiences that I have during those long runs that I cherish the most about being a distance runner. So as I mentioned, most of my running years I would run on average 3 to 4 weeks fairly consistently, and I probably would run about 20 to 25 miles a week. But if I was training for, say, a half marathon or a marathon, usually then my mileage I would gradually build up to 30-35 miles a week, or for the marathon I would even go up to maybe 35 or 40 miles a week. And from my observation, that's fairly low mileage, relatively speaking, to many people out there who train for the marathon distance. Certainly for elites, elite athletes are usually training anywhere from 80 to 160 miles a week, but they're also professionals. This is what they do. They have the time and the ability to put in those kind of miles, as they're primarily focused in on running. But for those of us who have families and jobs and other things that are demanding our time, and we can't devote that kind of time and energy and recovery, etc., to that, us mere mortals, if you will, as non-elites, many are able to, based on their season of life or even their schedule, able to maybe get 50, 60 miles or 70 miles a weekend. I've never been one of those individuals with that ability or luxury. So I've always typically trained on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to training for those types of races. But there's still basic principles that we can learn and apply regardless of what training volume we're able to fit in during the week. Last year when I kind of had a rejuvenation in my running, discovering the Maffetone training method, and as an empty nester now, both of my girls now are graduated from high school, out of the home, in college. One just graduated from college. I have a little bit more time to return to running and dedicate to running. And so I've actually been able to, over the past year, move that up to running 5 days a week fairly consistently. That's afforded me this extra time that I can find to add some more mileage to my week. And I've been able to average this, the past year, 30 to 35 miles a week. And even recently, as I've talked about desiring to train for another ultra marathon late summer, I'm actually striving to gradually build my mileage up to 40 to 45 miles a week. And so I'm able to apply some of these principles in their truest form as I'm getting my mileage up there, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that. But before I do, I want to talk about when you're doing your long runs. Generally speaking, this is something that you're running at an easy pace and a steady pace over the duration of the mileage that you're running, or over the time that you're running your long run. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb is not to exceed 25 to 30% of your weekly mileage for your long run, or to kind of cap it at 2.5 hours or 20 to 22 miles depending on your ability. Obviously, for many people, they wish they could run 20 to 22 miles in 2.5 hours for a training run. That's probably more for the elites, kind of where they're capping things off. But for others, this 25 to 30% rule is something worth striving for. And I'll be the first to admit, that's been a challenge for me, given that I've been on the lower end of the spectrum, training at 25, 30, or 30 to 35 miles a week. Most of my runs during the week are already at pretty close to that 20-25% mark. And so I have not really followed this rule of thumb, and my training I've been fortunate having just a long history of training. I've got a really strong foundation under me, and I've been able to do it and being very careful. But I've also experienced a lot of injury, probably due to pushing the envelope far too often. But that's a rule of thumb to strive for. I think nowadays where I'm at, I'm running more days during the week, I'm getting more mileage in. I think I've been a lot easier on myself, keeping those long runs, closer to those guidelines. And I've also been trying to use that 2 to 2.5 hour range to kind of target where the bulk of my long runs fall into. Regardless of what that mileage is, and just working with that and seeing how my body's adapting. And one of the things I talk about on this channel is, this is a journey. This is where we're constantly learning, and we're trying new things, and we're learning what works for us, and what works for you might be different. There's no rule of thumb. There's no formula that one size fits all. And so it's okay to experiment and try different things within reason, so that you reduce the risk and don't hurt yourself. Coming back to this principle of 25 to 30% of your weekly mileage dedicated to your long run. So let's just say that you're running 40 miles a week. 25% of that is 10 miles. And so 10 miles would be, really what you're targeting for. I probably right now, since I'm right around that 40 miles a week where I'm currently at in my training, my long runs have been 10 to 12 miles in there. So I'm still pushing the envelope a little bit, but generally speaking, that 8 to 12 mile range is where I've tried to get the majority of my long runs in. Now, I had a coach years ago who helped me during the marathon when I was doing a lot of marathons, and he used to say that once you hit 14 miles in your long runs, now you're training in earnest for a marathon. So anything 14 above is really is truly preparing you for the marathon distance. And I think some of the things that I've been reading, like with the Maffetone training method or the 80-20 and these other things that I've been researching and learning about lately, there seems to be a lot of talk around this idea of getting to that 2 or 2+ hours. So say 2 to 2.5 hour range for your long runs is really when your body is making the most adaptations as an endurance athlete. That's when your heart is getting the maximum training effect, and your body is adapting for long distance running. I think the other thing to keep in mind when we think about increasing our mileage, increasing the length of our long run over the course of our training cycles in preparation for these types of races, is another good rule of thumb, which I have tried to follow very, very carefully, given my relatively low mileage, is striving not to increase your weekly mileage by more than 10% on a given week from week to week. General rule of thumb is increase by up to 10 to 12% over a period of 2 to 3 weeks. I've typically done that. I'll increase it within that 10% range for 3 weeks in a row, and then I'll drop back significantly just to give my body a chance to catch up and to recover. Because as long distance athletes, we want to be able to run consistently, because the more consistent we are, in other words, injury free and not sidelined due to injury, I think the better our fitness is going to be, the more consistent progress we're going to make. And quite honestly, we enjoy running. We want to be out there running. We don't want to be sidelined. So one of our primary objectives as long distance runners is to be careful when we increase mileage and careful when we expand our long run to reduce the risk of injury. And the last thing I want to leave you with, something that I think of when I do long runs, is when I'm not training for a particular race, or I'm not in that training cycle for some sort of event, usually just keeping it a nice, easy, steady pace, like I said, is the goal. But when I train for a half marathon or a marathon, one of the things that I like to do as part of my long run is to incorporate some marathon pace efforts. So remember, we're running these long distances at an easier pace than, say, what we would race at. But I wanted to get some of those miles in my long run at marathon pace if I'm training for a marathon, just so I can kind of get used to the feel. And I want to gradually lengthen the portion of my long run to that up to a reasonable amount, so that I'm getting more comfortable, I'm getting more prepared for the type of stress that I'm going to endure during a race. But if I'm training for a half marathon or something like that, I also sometimes like to put in tempo or threshold miles in there, just to break up the monotony, but also to train tired legs to be able to turn over in a very controlled way. That's another fun thing that I kind of like to do to break it up. And then lastly, I've over the past decade have been doing a lot more trail running, trail races, and what I like to do for my long runs more and more, especially as I'm looking forward to this next ultra coming up at the end of summer, is I want to get as many long runs as I can on the trails. And if you've run any time on the trails, you know that you're already going to be slower. You're already not going to be able to put in the same amount of distance you would on the road, at least not within the same time frame. And so I really am looking at that 2 to 2.5 hour cutoff, and being comfortable and okay with that being the duration of my long runs on the trails. The more time I get in the trails and dealing with the terrain and all the unique challenges with that, I think the better prepared I'll be. I'm already doing some long runs where I can get the more mileage in on the roads, and so I'm okay with that. But that's just something to keep in mind for those of you that run trails. So I hope that you found this topic interesting. I hope that I was able to share some things with you to maybe give you some guidance if that's what you're looking for. If you've been training and doing long runs and you have some additional tips, please consider sharing those in the comments below with people who would come across this video. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing, and looking forward to future videos, or even checking out some of my other videos. In fact, I kind of want to revisit in my next video something very similar to this that you have to think about during the long runs, and that is the idea of hydration and refueling during these long runs. So if that's a topic of interest to you, make sure to check out an upcoming video right back here at Keep Running with BK, and I look forward to sharing those tips with you. So until next time, stay safe, train smart, and keep running.